Rene, we're still here recording at Techorama. I was just in the hallway having a conversation with some developers, and they were talking and complaining about they're building a large software project, and they had multiple implementations of the same problems, and it was really hard for everyone to know what decisions were made, why decisions were made. Have you come across this?
Yeah, I've also seen situations where you think, well, how did certain choices come, well, to this situation? And have there actually been a real choice? Like, yeah, well,
Was it a conscious choice?
conscious choice? Like, have people really critically thought about making this decision? And that is a good thing, because I also saw a session here on critical thinking, and I think that we should just do a podcast episode on critical thinking.
Let's go.
Okay, welcome to the Lead Podcast.
The Lead Podcast, a podcast for leaders in engineering, architecture, and development.
So, our guest, Laïla, welcome to the Lead Podcast.
Thank you.
And
Happy to be here.
We saw a session from you on the agenda around critical thinking and actually addressing the things that Geert mentioned in his starting point. So, who are you? What are you talking about? Can you relate to this? And can you help us out to understand this?
Well, I'm going to try. So, I'm a software engineer and solutions architect. I work for a company called Particular Software, where we build and service bus and messaging middleware technology and an entire platform around it. And just the story you were relaying just now is something that is really recognizable for me. I have my own horror stories. I've seen so many other people go through theirs. And it's also that exactly what sparked the idea of this talk. Because over the last years, what I've basically been doing is applying a more structured process around decision making, so that we can ensure that we're actually thinking critically and not just making decisions out of our emotions or out of our preferences or out of our beliefs that may be wrong. And that's what the whole sort of idea around this talk is, to basically try to avoid those horror scenarios. Because like you mentioned, right, usually it could be that those decisions are not happening consciously, but it could also be that they made sense when they were made at the time, but our context has changed and we just accept the status quo and then we don't go back and reevaluate those choices.
I really often have these conversations and ask, why did you do this? Yeah, we always do it this way.
Exactly. It's so easy, right?
Yeah, that's the default pitfall. Maybe they've been doing it for 10 years. So it must be the right choice.
Exactly.
Well,
but you also mentioned people make decisions based on emotions and not so much rational, maybe. But I also heard or read a number of books that you should trust your feeling, you should trust your gut. So how what your statement on, we do not have to make decisions on emotions related to trust your gut. How do you see that?
So I don't know if you've heard about the book Thinking Fast and Slow, but there are two modes of thinking, right? There's fast thinking and slow thinking. And also, you could also sort of think of it as, or other terms that have been used, is also convergent and divergent thinking. The idea is basically that when we are thinking from our gut, from our experience, from what we've already seen, those decisions may not always be rational. Because the thing is that our experiences, we had those experiences in a certain context. But we forget the details about that context. And today we're in a different context. So what made sense in a different project might not make sense today. It may be insufficient. It may be way too sophisticated for what we're trying to achieve. So I think it's important to have a more structured process around decision making so that we can ensure that we don't fall into those sort of pitfalls, if you will.
Well, then the logical question is the structured approach.
Yes.
Can you elaborate?
Absolutely. Well, it starts by thinking about the problem, which is something that, in my opinion, doesn't happen nearly sufficiently enough. I mean, if you open up a backlog, if you just take a look at the issues that you have, like how many of them are, structured, framed like a problem, and how many of them are already framed like a solution, implement X or do Y, But the thing is that if we can start from just describing a problem, and basically not jump into that solution mode, we can gain a bunch of things. First of all, we can get some clarity about what the problem really is, discuss it with peers, with stakeholders. Is this really what you need, right? How many problems we just eliminate by just asking those questions?
Is it really a problem?
Is it really a problem? Or is it more a symptom, friction of something that you're seeing?
Yeah.
And also because, when we talk about our stakeholders, yeah, but they asked us for this. Right. But did you ask them why they wanted this specific feature? What is the problem that they're trying to solve? They also jump into solution mode.
And also trying to talk to the people who have the actual problem instead of having all these proxies in between.
Yeah.
That all have their own translation,
And
their
then
own
we have-
opinions, their own biases.
And all the communication issues that happen along the way.
Yeah,
Definitely.
and I think that also the more technical people are, the more they know about possible solutions, the worse the problem is, right? If you know, like, well, it might a new architecture here or a service bus there or whatever thing
Yes.
that can solve this problem there, then that is what you're asking for, but
Yeah.
probably not.
It's also where that excitement about technology can get in our way, right? Because what I always say, we fall in love with solutions, right? But that's why it's important to actually focus on what is the problem, having that written down, having it clear so that anyone is able to understand it. No technical terms, right? Because if you use technical terms, you're probably in solution mode, even though you're trying to frame it as a problem.
Okay.
So that's the first step.
Yeah, makes sense. So second step, if there is a second step.
Absolutely. So part of also understanding the problem is understanding who it affects, right? So that's still in the same category. But then when you have that clarity around the problem, that's when you start to look into solutions. Now, I said solutions, right? It's important to consider multiple options and to consider options that may even feel like that they don't immediately make sense, that it's a little bit outside of our comfort zone, or maybe that we've been told not to do these types of things. But it's important to also understand that when we're taught about certain anti-patterns, there are reasons that there are anti-patterns. But you could be in a different context, right? That may still make that a good idea because maybe it's something really small, maybe you're not exposed to the downsides. And that's where I think having a structured approach can be really helpful. So multiple alternatives. One of the things I also always recommend is to brainstorm about options in a more diverse group.
Okay.
Now, I'm not only talking about diversity in terms of gender or race or all of these things, although they're also important, but more diversity in professional background.
Yeah.
Okay.
People who think differently than you. I always say if you put 10 engineers in a room and you ask them to solve a problem, they're going to give you engineering specific solutions. Right? But if you throw in people with different ways of thinking, maybe someone who has expertise in sales or product management, or he's a business expert, who's on the road. It could be even that it's a graphic designer, right? It doesn't really matter. People who think differently than us, and then with an open mind, being willing to accept their opinions and just have a sort of open conversations of what the options could be.
Yeah, yeah. And but what role does so when you bring in a number of people in the room, for example, you bring in the CEO or some product manager or some high-profile person, what influence can those people bring into the conversation? Because I think it can also be a negative one.
It definitely can. You're basically talking about authority bias, where basically you may have someone with an authority, right? And when they're part of the conversation, when they propose something, there's an immediate bias of, well, they're the CEO.
Yeah, they proposed this.
He's probably right? Or they are probably right. So that's definitely something. It's also called the hippo effect. I find this a funny one. The highest paid person's opinion, the hippo effect.
So what would you advise our listeners who maybe are in this role, that they are the hippo in the group, and then how can you still be part of the conversation?
Yes.
Should you avoid making suggestions or?
Well, one of the things that I've seen work really well is not that you can't collaborate, that you can't make suggestions, but to wait.
No.
Basically allow everyone else to speak freely and to come up with their own options, and also to not react with judgment. So if someone would say something and as a CEO, I'm thinking, oh my God, that's a terrible idea, right? Instead of also making that clear that I've had that judgmental thought is to, instead of that judgment, approach it with curiosity. That's an interesting idea. Like, can you walk me through your thought process? Why do you think, how would you think that would solve the problem? And that would be the first stage, is to collaborate that way, to just, go into that conversation with everyone else in the room. And then if that person has their own ideas, to defer to the end of the conversation and say, okay, these are all really good ideas. I also had a couple that I also want to share in addition to what was already said. And that's a very good way to release some of that pressure, to allow people to think and speak freely.
I think that
restrain.
I think that works really well, but I'm still a bit scared then. Okay, we have 4 options. Now, as a leader of the group, I will opt for option 5. Does that lower the expectations of option 1 to 4?
No, because that's not what's going to happen. So the idea was, now we have options, let's say 5, 6, right? And then the idea is that we're going to look at these, each one of them in isolation, and we're going to think, okay, so is this solving the problem, and in which way is it addressing the problem? Another thing that we need to become aware of is, what assumptions are we making in the sense that this could solve the problem? Because assumptions are statements that we believe to be true, right? But these can basically present gaps in our decision making if they end up being false. That's a risk. So what we want to do is, I'm not saying that you shouldn't make assumptions, but it's rather the process of becoming aware of the assumptions that you make, and then maybe taking some time to validate this. Are there any data points that support this? Why do I think this? Is there anyone that I could go and double check with, right?
And also try to make the options maybe less personal. It's not like, so we're choosing between Laila's idea and Rene's idea, right?
Exactly.
Because then you really push forward this authority. And if you just make a list, okay, we have 5 options. These are the options. These are the pros and cons, and removing that personal relationship with the options, make it.
That is essential. It's a group effort, right? And it's a group decision. And whether the CEO is there, that doesn't really matter. That's
an also interesting point. If we're talking about option and critical thinking, it's also kind of a risk if I propose 3 options, like and make a choice between option 1, 2, or 3. So people are really tend to choose an option 1, 2, or 3 instead of maybe asking the question, like, is there also an option 4, 5, or 6, or 7?
You're already fast forwarding way too much.
Okay.
But that's a very good point. But okay, let me just circle back a little bit to those alternatives, right? So we have those assumptions we want to become aware of, but also which risks do these present, right? So we can evaluate those in isolation and without even comparing to other options, right? And that's going to make it so that we're going to be able to say, well, option 1, 2, and 3, those are out the window. They're not good ideas. But we still have 4, 5, and 6. And that's when we can start doing this trade-off analysis. Now, you had a really good question, but one of the things that we, for example, also do as part of our decision making is that when we reach a conclusion of, okay, this is the decision that we should go forward with, that's when we open it up for feedback.
Okay.
So basically, we go through what we call an RFC process, a request for comments, where we make available that entire structured decision-making that we went through. This is the problem. These are all the options that we thought of. These are the assumptions and the risks and all the data that supports that this is a good idea or supports that this is a bad idea. All of those things linked. That's why we believe that this is the way forward. And then that's presented open for feedback. Now, why do we do that? Is because now you're making that available to people who haven't been involved in the process at all. So they're not affected by groupthink, by any of the biases that may have been happening in the group, even authority bias. And as long as what you said, right, is that we're not going to have, this is the CEO's option. No, they're just, this is an option. That's another way to sort of mitigate that authority bias is, we just had 5 options. Who they came from? They came from the group. Right? And that's where people who don't have that insight can come in, read, okay, what's the problem they're trying to solve? These are the options. And that's where we can say, wait, you may have missed an option here. And that's part of the feedback process, is to not say I agree or I disagree, but to validate the decision-making process, right?
And how do you typically structure that? So you had to have the discussion, there is a write-down of that discussion, and then what do you do? Do you email people? Do you invite them in another meeting? Or how do you approach that?
Well, no meetings. We write things down, right? Because then at least once we have it written down, we can gain a lot of that. First big advantage, you can scale the process. You can schedule a meeting with 5 people. You can't schedule a meeting with 50 people, right? But if you have a document, then you can send that document to 50 people. And of course, you don't necessarily want the 50 people to share their feedback, but that allows you to use RFC deadlines, for example. And then whoever is able to provide any feedback, that's good enough.
Okay.
That's also how you get that diversity of input.
Yeah, that sounds really good.
Yeah, I
Really
think
great.
what I read somewhere is an approach by Martin Fowler. I think he called this architecture decision forum or something. And
Architecture decision records, I think.
No, this is actually a
forums,
forum.
actually. Okay.
So when you're discussing architectural decision records or your RFCs, to actually have a bi-weekly or monthly meeting to go over the different proposed things, so actually people can have their say and are also updated about all the changes that are being made.
Okay, that's
So
really cool.
instead of doing everything async, which has its benefits, as you just said, first of all, everything is documented, etc. It is also good to have all the people actually in a room or in a online room to hear what were the important decisions that were being made. So people can learn from it, and it also comes back to the example that I used in the beginning, where like, okay, we made multiple decisions for the same problem because it's we didn't read that RFC 2 months ago, and now we're working on the same problem again. And if you do this in a meeting kind of style, you can actually and people can comment like, okay, yeah, this is basically a solved problem already. So I'd like to tend this with all the problems. You can discuss them 3 times. Like initially, like, this is a problem. We need to come up with the solutions, or who can help us define the different options, etc. Yes, just mentioning it, what the problem space is. Then the next time coming back, like, okay, this is the RFC. And after that, after the RFCs actually went through all the feedback cycle, this is the end conclusion that we took. So everyone is informed about the actual decisions as well. So I kind of like that process. Maybe it can be combined with the RFC process that you...
Yeah, I think it definitely could be. A couple of thoughts about that, because I hadn't heard about that, but I'll definitely look into it. But one of the things that you said is you might not have read the RFC, but equally true is that you might not have joined the meeting. So I think that gap is always going to exist. I think it's a good idea based on the assumption that you've always written things down.
Yeah.
Because then at least even later in time, there's something that you can go back to and that you can refer to, that you can see the evolution.
Yeah,
right?
I fully agree. And so writing things down is key. What I do think, as you said, yeah, you could not have, maybe you weren't at that previous meeting. If someone else in the meeting was there, they can say, well, we already discussed this, or that they can help you point towards that previous record. And otherwise you really need to keep up with all the RFCs that are being posted.
Well, I give you some insight into how we do this, which is a question that you also asked earlier. So the way we structure this is in a PR.
Mm-hmm.
So it's basically a markdown file with, this is the problem, these are the alternatives, the structured decision-making. I have templates, I can share the link with you as well afterwards. And this is the proposed decision. Now on the PR, people can comment, right? If someone would then say, oh, but we've already, faced a problem like this, or we've already talked about these solutions or that problem space, that's when they can go back to the rest of the documentation, link that and say, wait, you're redoing this, and that would halt the effort, right?
Yeah.
I think the asynchronous approach also has some advantages in the sense that it's just so hard to get everyone in a room, especially when you're working in larger corporations that maybe also have collaboration across time zones, right?
Yeah.
And then in an asynchronous approach, of course, you do have a deadline for the RFC, but the assumption is that because you scaled the process and you've made it available to a large group of people, that there will be sufficient validation so that we're not doing crazy things, basically, and that we haven't missed those big things. Could be that we miss small things, and that's why we reevaluate decisions when we need to.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I think in the process that you mentioned, you walk through a number of steps, the thinking about the problem, who was affected, coming up with options, then the request for comments. And then I think we jumped a little bit ahead because
We did, yeah.
we have the request for comments because I'm fascinated about the process. I like process. So request for comments, and then everybody puts in their comments.
Right.
And then what happens then?
Right.
Because
This is always
you need to
say-
step back.
Yeah, it's tricky, right? Because when you open up a decision for a wide group to give feedback on, that's a source for disagreement,
Of course.
right? So, and that's where it's really interesting, our approach to feedback as well. It's important to understand what is the goal of that feedback process. And the goal is not that everyone agrees on the decision. The goal is, were there gaps in the decision making? Did we forget alternatives? Is there a risk that we overlooked? Is our mitigation strategy for the high risks sufficiently thought through? Are there any false assumptions that we are making? That's the things that we are looking for feedback, not I agree, I disagree, right? And the thing is that I sometimes read an RFC and my entire gut is screaming at me, this is a horrible idea. Like, what are you doing? But the thing is that I have to also apply critical thinking to my feedback.
Why is this all?
Why do I feel this way?
Exactly. Yeah.
What did they miss, right? Did they miss an alternative? Are they solving the wrong problem, right? Is this introducing a new problem?
Yeah.
So is there a missing
Yeah,
risk?
so you need to critical think for yourself.
For yourself.
Like reflect on yourself. Why am I having this emotional reaction?
Exactly.
And why? I don't understand. So first reflect a bit on
Exactly.
yourself. Yeah.
And you know what the interesting thing about that process is that I've gone through this, right? And I'm like, this is a horrible idea. And then I'm thinking about, okay, did they miss anything? What did they miss? And sometimes I can't find anything. But that's where you realize these are my biases at play. These are my underlying beliefs, false beliefs, or beliefs that maybe don't apply in this context that are causing me to feel this way. But actually, the decision making is sound. And that creates this sort of dynamic of I may not necessarily agree with the decision, but I can accept it because I can't see any flaws in it.
That's where, and it's a whole different topic and a different episode that we had about psychological safety. You need to have this to actually respond to the RFC with your comments like, I have these doubts. And they might be a bias, but it is good to be able to add those comments, even if you just have some wrong assumptions. You want to verify that with others. And it requires some safety and some guts to actually do this and then say, well, maybe this decision is wrong. I think this and this. I think different than the current options. So that's also very key.
Absolutely, I fully agree. And sadly, this still requires a culture shift, right? In many organizations. Now, I think that once you have an RFC process, that's really the only way that it works. Because otherwise, what happens is that you have people who are more comfortable speaking up, that are always speaking up, and people who feel less comfortable or more afraid to say things that are wrong or that may be perceived as stupid or you don't know enough. So that definitely requires a culture shift.
I also really like the idea of having this written down and having some kind of, I don't know, PR, markdown, whatever.
Exactly.
So that everybody can actually contribute instead of like, I'm inviting these 10 people into the room, or I'm having a meeting with a few groups, but then there is always people not invited or sick or whatever.
Yeah.
But then, like, if you open it up for a little bit broader audience by having a document, I really
And not
like-
only that, but think about introverts
yeah,
who are
exactly.
maybe, less willing to speak up during a live meeting. But when they can sit down with a PR, with a structured document, they can think about what it is that they want to say. Not only introverts, but people that can't think on the spot,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
People that need a little bit of time to digest what is being said, what is being proposed. They can think about it, and they have time to structure their own thoughts and then bring it back and say, okay, this and this and that, what is what
Or
I
do
see
some
wrong.
research before speaking up.
Yeah.
If they don't have the
Right.
feeling of actually speaking about things they're not sure about.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Is this also typically something you see within decisions really related to technology and architectural things, or is it also applicable to, I don't know, organizational decisions?
Well, for us, we apply this to all major decisions. So not every small decision, of course, because that's a
Yeah.
very elaborated
Yeah.
process that is costly. But any impactful decision, whether it's in the organization, whether it affects staff, whether it affects, organizational policies or technical decisions, we take the same approach.
Okay.
For the smaller things, we will use ADRs,
Yeah.
right? Architecture decision records. We chose this design over that design, and that is our reasoning. And we consider that to be enough because if that were, not a good idea, we can always change it later.
Yeah.
If we're facing something that we think, oh, this is going to be hard to change later, then we RFC,
Yeah.
even if it's a technical decision.
So is the ADR also the end state of the whole bigger process with RFCs, etc., or is there more steps to follow?
So the template is different, right? For ADRs, we use a simple template where we're just describing the context and these are the consequences and these are the risks and that's all. An RFC is a lot more elaborate because we're linking stakeholders, their needs. We're thinking about the assumptions we made, the risks, the alternatives. We're linking data. We're linking maybe, outside references, things that we validate. There's a lot more that goes into it. So you could also say that that's a sort of ADR template. I'm happy to share the template that I have later with you.
Yeah, I would love to.
And you could say, this is also kind of an ADR template, but it's like, don't use that for the small decisions.
No, but
right?
if you have gone
It's
through
a
the
lot more
process,
sophisticated.
you have to gather all the comments. Eventually,
Right.
the decision has to be made. Like
Exactly.
I like that approach as well. I've used it several times, at least. Having two types of decisions, like small decisions, teams can just do that on their own, at least documented, as you said, using an ADR or any way they want, as long as everyone does it in the same way. And then that more elaborate thing on bigger changes where more people are involved.
Exactly.
And especially focused on how hard are things to change later on when we need to revert this issue. If reverting is instantly or does not cost any money, then immediately it's a small change.
Exactly. But it's not only how easy is it to revert tomorrow, but 6 months from now or a year from now.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. And those are the small decisions. Yes, exactly. And that's when we would just document the change and move on. But to circle back to your question, right? You said now the decision has to be made.
Yeah.
Well, the idea is that the decision has already been proposed, right? By the group that put out the RFC. The thing is that if someone would be able to say, you missed an alternative, you missed an option here, then the group has to go back and reevaluate, right? And that's when they propose a new decision, which could be the same as already was, right? But at least they've thought through this additional option. Now, that's post the sort of RFC period. Then they have to go through, address all of the comments, and either say, okay, we've documented this there, or we've addressed that there, or we've included another mitigation strategy for that risk that you pointed out, or we've evaluated this option and that's the way we're going forward now, or no, we're still sticking to our decision because of these reasons.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where the decision is finalized and it's merged.
Well, sounds really, really interesting. I think a process that we can also use in our own organization, and I think many organizations can benefit from a structured approach on there, because I think we do bits and bytes, and here and there we do the things that you mentioned, but having like an approach. So I think if you can share the template also with listeners so that we can put it in the show notes.
Yes, I have it on my GitHub repo.
Okay,
also, the talk is on YouTube if anyone wants to rewatch that. So Happy to
we
share.
we can provide the links, and I think we already come to a close because it's already half an hour, and
it was a great conversation.
it was great conversation. So thank you, Laila, for sharing all your
You're most
knowledge and
welcome.
expertise.
Yeah, thanks.
So, and for the listeners, this was it. So I hope to listen and to hear you in the next episode of the Lead Podcast. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
The Lead Podcast, a podcast for leaders in engineering, architecture, and development.